Hello and welcome back to this lecture. In this lecture, we are going to be discussing about functions returning functions. So I have written a simple code to explain this concept. So let's go through it together. So now I have declared a function greet which is on a global scope as we have discussed in the last lecture. The greet function is on a global scope. Now within the greet function, we have the greeting function. So this greeting function is on a local scope. It is within the scope of this greet function. So basically, the greet function takes in a parameter language. We have short it to lang, and this greeting function takes in a parameter name. So within this greeting function, we do some normal, we have like a conditional statement which checks the language and tries to concatenate it with the name and do all sort of things. So what we have here now is a nested function now. But the major thing is that when we look at it now, we have this greet function, and within it we have this greeting function. So at the end of everything, this greet function returns greeting function. So what we are used to is we have seen functions returning values like integers and string and all kind of stuff, but we haven't experienced a function returning another function. So basically, what we are going to be doing here is now that once this greet function, it takes in a parameter language. So let me add type int in here. Let me add it that language is a string, and name is also a string. So just so we just to be sure. So now let's try to call this greet function now. To call a function, we call it using the function name, and we supply the parameter language. Let me enter English. So you can see that we have to follow this conditional statement that we have within the greet function. So let me enter English as the language. So we have that. Run our code. So as we all know that whenever we have a return statement and we call that Python function that has the return statement, nothing would happen. We won't see anything in our terminal that like justifies that something has really happened. Basically, nothing happens. So, but don't forget that once it hits the return, the whole execution goes back. So the thing is, if you can remember from the last lecture, I said that if within a global scope, like when a function is in a global scope and it doesn't call the function in the local scope will not get executed. But at this point now, in this point, this greet function did not call this greeting function, but it returned it. And you know that whenever we have a return statement, the value that we have returned will get saved in the caller, and in this caller now, it means this greeting function is now saved in this caller because it is the greeting function is what has been returned from this greet function. I hope you understand, and I hope this is not confusing. So now if we save this into a variable, let's call this variable greet1, that is the first greet. So now what I'm doing here is that we have called this greet function and we have supplied a parameter. So we know that from our past experience that whenever a function is returning a value, the value will be saved into the caller. So that is to tell us now that this greet function, which is what this greeting function, which is what the greet function has returned, is now saved within this variable. So this is to tell us that this greet1 now is like representing this greeting function that has been returned by this greet function. It's quite complicated, but if we like take our time to understand the code, it isn't as complicated as it seems. So now finally, to now actually see a result, we can now do this again. Since what is saved into this greet1 function, this greet1 variable is a function, then we can call it. Do you understand? You know what the value that we return from this greet function is another function. So that's the major aim of this lecture. We are discussing functions that are returning other functions. So the value that was returned from this greet function is another function. So that means that this greet1 variable is saving a function within itself. So since it is saving a function within itself, we can now call that function it's saving by doing this. So you can now see that this, by trying to call this function now, we can see that we have a prompt asking for, let me show you again, asking for the name. So this is telling us that this function here, greeting, is what is here. You can see it is what is here. It's now asking us to provide a name. So now let me provide my name as Philip. So to so that's that. I hope it's not too confusing. The first thing that happened here is that we called this our greet function, and what our greet function is doing is that our greet function is returning another function. So since it is returning another function, and we know that whenever a function is returning a value, the value is returning would get assigned to the caller, and we have assigned this caller now to another variable called greet1. So since the value it is holding in this case is a function, is another function, and that function is greeting function. So we can also call that function using by providing the parameter it needs, and the parameter for the greeting function is the name, and I have provided the name Philip. So now this greeting function too would get executed, and when we look at the function body, we see that it compares this language that it has gotten from the parent. We can call this greeting function the parent function, while we can call this like this as the child function, because it is sitting within its scope, so we can call it the child function, while this greet function is the parent function. So this greet function, which is the parent function, takes in the language and it returns this greeting function. So this greeting function is now saved into this variable, and this variable now it can serve as a function on its own, since what is saved within it is a function. So we now call that function and we provide the name parameter, which is the name that is required. So the argument here is Philip. So now in the function body of this greeting, we have a conditional statement that checks the provided language and it returns a greeting message. So it's not like it prints a greeting message, it returns it. So what happens now is that even when we have called this greet1 this greet1 function now, we won't still see anything in our terminal because it is not printing anything, it is just returning a string. So we can add this here, that this returns a string, basically type anything. So now when we have run our code the next time but we still don't get anything, so when we print out this now, or we can just assign this to another variable again. So greeting one equals this. So when we now print this now, we now finally get to see our output. You understand? So let's try to print it. So at last you can see we now have hello Philip. So the moment I change this English to Spanish, you would notice that I will have another output. So you can see I have hola Philip. The reason is because this parameter gets passed into this function body. The reason why we can access this parameter, this lang parameter from this function is because this function is within its scope, so it can access parameters that is within, you understand. This is the parent function, it accepts a parameter language. So this greeting is the child function, so it has access to parameters or variables within this scope, you understand, because this is, it is within its scope, it has access to it. Assuming it within another, like, let me write another function up here, def let me just name this out scoped. So, and this is now, maybe this is taking a parameter called param, and it just does nothing basically. This is just to show us something. So now, because this is another function on its own and it is not in any way connected to this greeting function, this greeting function can't access its parameter. But because this parent function is the function that is encapsulating this greeting function can get access to this parameter. So it is using this parameter to work in, like, it is using this parameter within its own function body, within its own body, to determine the greeting message to send out. So I hope with this lecture now you understand how functions that return function works. So basically now, this greeting function, which is the child function, has access to any variable within its scope, like a parameter and any other variable, it has access to it. So any changes made to this parameter or argument would also affect the output of this, you understand, because they are in the same scope, so they make use of the same variables to determine what they do and everything, and how everything works. So that is that about function returning function. I would appreciate any form of questions in the Q&A section if you have any doubt or you find this lecture confusing. This lecture is a little bit advanced, but you have to learn it one way or the other. See you in the next lecture.